Here's something that might surprise you. If you want to know what an American thinks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just ask them what they believe religiously. Not in some vague spiritual sense, but with religious tradition, if any, they follow. The data is stark, almost uncomfortably clear. Your religious identity predicts your views on this conflict better than almost anything else. We're diving into a Pew Research Center survey that asked Americans from different faith traditions how they feel about the Israeli people, the Palestinian people, the Israeli government, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas. The results? They tell us something uncomfortable about who we are as a nation, how religion shapes our politics, and why we are so divided on this issue. Here's what we're going to do. Lay out the numbers honestly, explain what they actually mean, and stop pretending this conflict doesn't reveal something pretty fundamental about American identity politics. So, no hedging, no diplomatic softening, just the data and what it shows us. This survey comes from Pew Research, which polled Americans across 7 major religious groups. They asked a simple but revealing question. Do you view these groups favorably or not? The 5 entities rated were the Israeli people, the Palestinian people, the Israeli government, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas. 7 religious groups were surveyed: white evangelical Protestants, white non-evangelical Protestants, Black Protestants, Catholics, Jewish Americans, Muslim Americans, and the religiously unaffiliated, what researchers call the nones, N-O-N-E-S. The methodology is solid. The breakdown by religious affiliation is granular enough to show real patterns, and the results are consistent enough that we can actually say something meaningful about how American religious identity predicts foreign policy views. This isn't speculation. There are 35 data points that paint a picture of America's relationship with this conflict. So let's start with the most striking finding. 57% of white evangelical Protestants view the Israeli government favorably. By contrast, only 47% of Jewish Americans do. Let that sink in. The group most committed to supporting Israel, theologically, politically, and culturally, is white evangelicals, not Jewish Americans. This is the opposite of what most people assume. Why is that? It's because of Christian Zionism. It's a theological belief that holds the return of Jewish people to Israel is a prerequisite for the end times, a key part of evangelical eschatology. That's not anti-Semitic in intent. It's actually deeply pro-Israel in practice. But it's also worth noting, evangelical support for Israel is rooted in end times theology, not in solidarity with Jewish people per se. And that distinction matters. When you look at the Israeli people specifically, not the government, the pattern holds. 74% of white evangelicals view the Israeli people favorably, the second highest after Jewish Americans at 83%. White evangelicals are the backbone of Christian support for Israel in America. This isn't controversial in evangelical churches. It's mainline theology. But here's what some might consider the uncomfortable part. Jewish Americans, the actual Jewish Americans whose safety and existence the pro-Israel movement claims to defend, are more skeptical of their government than evangelicals are. That tells you something important about the nature of support. It's not necessarily about Jewish safety. It's about theology and politics. Let's be clear though, Jewish Americans have the highest favorability toward the Israeli people at 83%. That's consistent with ethnic and religious ties. But here's where it gets complex. When you ask about the Israeli government, only 47% of Jewish Americans view it favorably. This is crucial. It means over half of Jewish American respondents don't have a favorable view of the Israeli government. They distinguish between their connection to Israel as a homeland and as a people, and their political views about how that government operates. What about on the Palestinian people? 40% of Jewish Americans view them favorably. That's not hostility, it's just lower than other groups. It suggests a more skeptical or reserved stance toward Palestinian people as a group, even as many Jewish Americans are critical of the Israeli government policies. On Hamas, 2% of Jewish Americans view it favorably. That's the lowest of any group. This makes sense. Hamas has explicitly called for the destruction of Israel and Jewish people. So when you see strong Jewish American views on this, remember that context. So white evangelicals are the strongest supporters of Israel among all groups except Jewish Americans themselves. Here are the numbers. 74% favor the Israeli people. 57% favor the Israeli government. 33% favor the Palestinian people. 10% favor the Palestinian Authority. 4% favor Hamas. The pattern is unmistakable. Overwhelming support for Israel across all metrics, with Palestinian entities at the bottom. This reflects the Christian Zionist theology that dominates evangelical churches. It's not hatred of Palestinians, it's just not the focus. The focus is Israel as a nation, Israel as a restored Jewish homeland, and the theological significance of that for Christian theology. The fact that only 33% of white evangelicals favor Palestinian people is worth noting. It's not that evangelicals are uniquely hostile. Other Christian groups show similar or lower numbers. But it does reflect a prioritization of one side that's deeper than just geopolitical calculation. It's theological. So mainline Protestants, like Methodists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, etc., show a notable shift compared to evangelicals. 55% favor Israeli people, but that's significantly lower than the evangelical 74%. On the Israeli government, only 33% view it favorably, compared to the evangelical 57%. So that's a 24-point gap. On Palestinians, 45% of mainline Protestants favor Palestinian people, 12 points higher than evangelicals. Mainline churches have historically been more focused on social justice and peace activism than on end times theology. It shows. On the Palestinian Authority, 20% of mainline Protestants view it favorably. On Hamas, 6%. Still low, but significantly higher than evangelicals. The overall picture, mainline Protestants are more skeptical of Israel's government and slightly more open to Palestinians than their evangelical cousins. Black Protestants stand out. On the Israeli people, 50% view them favorably. That's lower than evangelicals and mainline groups. On Palestinian people, 54%. That's higher, the first time we see a Christian group more favorable to Palestinians than to Israelis. On the Israeli government, 30% of Black Protestants view it favorably. On the Palestinian Authority, 31%. These are basically equal. Black Protestants don't strongly favor either government, but they slightly lean toward a more balanced view. On Hamas, 17% of Black Protestants view it favorably. That's notably higher than other Christian groups, but still a minority. Why the difference? Likely connection to liberation theology, as well as solidarity with oppressed peoples and the historical memory of Black activism in civil rights. Israel-Palestine is seen through that lens. Which side is the underdog? Which side faces systemic oppression? Catholics. Catholics sit somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. 51% favor the Israeli people, 48% favor the Palestinian people. So Catholics are nearly balanced, almost split 50-50 on how they view these two peoples. On governments, the picture is similar. 34% favor the Israeli government, 20% the Palestinian Authority. Catholics aren't as strongly pro-Israel as evangelicals, but they are not particularly pro-Palestinian either. They're split. On Hamas, 8% of Catholics view it favorably. That's quite low, reflecting deep skepticism toward Hamas among Catholics, consistent with other Christian groups. For Muslim Americans showed the clearest pro-Palestinian pattern. 78% favor the Palestinian people. only 26% favor the Israeli people. That's the lowest favorability toward Israel of any group. On governments, 50% favor the Palestinian Authority. Only 12% favor the Israeli government. Again, the lowest of any group. Here's the important part. 44% of Muslim Americans view Hamas favorably. That's the highest of any group. And still, it's less than half. 56% of Muslim Americans do not view Hamas favorably. This is crucial because it demolishes the narrative that support for Palestinian people equals support for Hamas. Even in the group most sympathetic to Palestinians and most critical of Israel, less than half view Hamas positively. Now for the religiously unaffiliated group, the nuns, as the research group calls it, which is spelled N-O-N-E-S. The religious unaffiliated are the second most sympathetic to Palestinians after Muslim Americans. 59% favor Palestinian people. Only 40% favor Israeli people. That's a 19-point gap. On governments, 17% favor the Israeli government. 30% favor the Palestinian Authority. Again, a clear lean toward the Palestinian side, though not overwhelming. On Hamas, 11% of the unaffiliated view it favorably. That's roughly double the Christian groups, but still a small minority. Why? The nuns tend to be younger and more progressive politically. They're more likely to view this conflict through a human rights and occupation lens than through religious identity. Palestine-Israel activism is strong on college campuses and among younger progressives, mainly of whom are religiously unaffiliated. That shows in the data. Here's what jumps out when you look at all the data together. Across virtually every religious group, people favor the people more than they favor the governments. Take white evangelicals. 74% favor the Israeli people, but only 57% favor the Israeli government. That's a 17-point drop. On the Palestinian side, only 33% favor Palestinian people, but it's even lower, 10%, on the Palestinian Authority. Take Muslim Americans. 78% favor the Palestinian people, but only 50% favor the Palestinian Authority. That's a 28-point drop. On the Israeli side, only 26% favor the Israeli people, but even fewer, 12%, favor the Israeli government. Take the religiously unaffiliated. 59% favor Palestinian people, but only 30% favor the Palestinian Authority. 40% favor Israeli people, but only 17% favor the Israeli government. Take Jews. 83% favor Israeli people, but only 47% favor the Israeli government. That's a 36-point gap. So what does this all mean? It means Americans across the board, regardless of religious affiliation, distinguish between empathy for people and political approval of governments. We feel some sympathy for regular Israelis and regular Palestinians as human beings, but we don't trust or approve of their governments equally. This is actually profound. It suggests that Americans aren't driven by hatred or dehumanization. It's not that evangelicals hate Palestinians or Muslims hate Israelis as human beings. It's that political alignment, government trust, and ethnic/religious identity creates distance. In other words, there's a gap between our humanity and our politics. And that gap exists across all groups. Nobody is a pure monolith. Even the most pro-Israel group, the white evangelicals, and the most pro-Palestinian group, the Muslims, both draw a line between peoples and governments. So here's a narrative you hear consistently. If you support Palestinians, you support Hamas. The data shreds this argument. Even among Muslim Americans, the group most sympathetic to Palestinians, Only 44% view Hamas favorably. 56% do not. More than half of America's Muslim population doesn't view Hamas favorably. Among the religiously unaffiliated, who lean pro-Palestinian at 59%, only 11% view Hamas favorably. That's 1 in 9. Among Black Protestants, the Christian group most sympathetic to Palestinians, only 17% view Hamas favorably. Among mainline Protestants, 6%. Among Catholics, 8%. Among white evangelicals, 4%. Among Jewish Americans, 2%. The most generous interpretation, in the most pro-Palestine demographic, the Muslims, less than half support Hamas. In every other group, support is single digits. This destroys the conflation. You can, and most Americans do, distinguish between supporting Palestinian people and supporting Hamas as an organization. The data shows this. You don't have to be pro-Hamas to be pro-Palestinian. Most people aren't. Hamas has low favorability across the board because it means opposition to Hamas isn't uniquely American or uniquely pro-Israel. Even Muslims in America, who have the strongest sympathy for Palestinian cause, don't want Hamas in the majority. So here's what we learned. Religion is a massive predictor of geopolitical views. Your faith tradition, or lack thereof, shapes how you see Israel and Palestine. White evangelical theology, particularly Christian Zionism and end times theology, creates strong support for Israel. That support is real, deep, and theological, not just political. It comes from religious conviction. Muslim Americans and other groups with ties to the Islamic world lean pro-Palestinian, but even they distinguish between Palestinians as a people and Hamas as an organization. Jewish Americans are complicated, deeply connected to Israel as a homeland, but skeptical of its government. Black Protestants draw from solidarity traditions and liberation theology. The religious unaffiliated, mostly younger and more progressive, lean Palestinian. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Across all these groups, there's a gap between how people feel about regular human beings and how they feel about governments and organizations. That gap is real and it's consistent. Americans, whatever their religion, don't reduce this to simple support or opposition. We feel some empathy even for people on the other side. This matters for policy. When politicians claim they have a mandate to support Israel or Palestine absolutely, they're not reading the data accurately. Americans are divided, yes, but they are divided in complex ways. Support for Israel doesn't mean hatred of Palestinians. Sympathy for Palestinian cause doesn't mean support for Hamas. We are not a country of pure tribes. Except we kind of are along religious lines, though. The data shows religion as the predictor of foreign policy views more clearly than almost anything else. That's not reassuring. It suggests our views on the world are shaped by inherited theological commitments more than by actual political calculation. So American foreign policy doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's shaped by public opinion, congressional districts, voting blocs, and electoral politics. When you understand that white evangelicals are 25 to 30% of the American electorate and are the most strongly pro-Israel group, you understand why American policy has tilted pro-Israel for decades. But the picture is more complex than the headline. Younger Americans are less evangelical and more religiously unaffiliated. They lean pro-Palestinian. As demographics shift, foreign policy pressure points shift. Maybe not immediately, but inevitably. The data also reveals something about American identity politics. We don't just disagree on domestic policy. We disagree on fundamental worldview questions, like who the oppressed are, which nations deserve support, what justice looks like. All of this partly because of religious identity. That's not unique to Israel-Palestine. But this conflict brings it into sharp relief because the religious map of America overlays almost perfectly onto the geopolitical map of this conflict. Evangelicals pray for Israel in their churches. Muslims feel solidarity with their ummah. Jews have ancestral ties. Progressives see occupation and colonialism. Religious identity predicts all of this. Here's what the survey doesn't tell you: the depth of conviction, how strongly people hold these views, whether they'd actually support military action, how views have changed over time, or whether these same people can be persuaded by new information. Favorable is vague. It could mean strong conviction or casual agreement. The survey captures a moment in time, not a trajectory. But what it does tell you is clear. America is divided along religious lines on this issue, in ways that are structural and deep. So now let's boil this down. Religion predicts your views of Israel-Palestine more reliably than almost anything else. White evangelicals, driven by Christian Zionist theology, are America's strongest pro-Israel constituency. Muslim Americans lean pro-Palestinian. Jewish Americans are complicated, deeply connected to Israel, but skeptical of its government. The religiously unaffiliated, mostly younger and progressive, lean Palestinian. Everyone else is somewhere in the middle. But here's the honest part. Even within these groups, most Americans distinguish between peoples and governments. They have some empathy even for the other side. They don't support Hamas, even if they support Palestinian people. They don't hate Palestinians, even if they support the Israeli government. We are not a nation of pure monolithic tribes. We are a nation of overlapping identities, religious commitments, and political allegiances. This data shows that. Yes, religion predicts views, but prediction isn't determinism. People surprise us. The real insight here isn't that religion divides us. It always does, on every issue. The real insight is that even when religion is the strongest predictor, most of us still draw a line between our empathy for people and our political choices. That's not nothing. That's actually the thing worth holding on to. Because if Americans could only see people in their own religious/ethnic/political tribe as fully human, this conflict would be even more intractable than it is. The fact that evangelicals still think Palestinian people are people, that Muslims still think Israeli people are people, that everyone still prefers people to governments, that suggests we're not entirely locked into tribal warfare. But we are also not far from it. Religion still predicts everything. We are still sorted into different spiritual tribes that vote differently, think differently, and see the world through fundamentally different theological lenses. That's the data. That's the truth. And it's something we should probably think about, whether we're looking at foreign policy or domestic politics. That's it for this episode. Please give this a like, subscribe, comment, and give us a rating. Until then, take care.